Hi everyone, it's Gemma aka Jam Jar Sews, and I'm here for another exciting project with Bombay Stores Fabrics. So they've sent me this lovely purple, lilac and white striped fabric. This is a cotton seersucker. I haven't worked with this type of fabric before, but I know it's going to be nice and floaty for the summer. And they said I could come up with a pattern that I wanted to try. So I'm going with the Butterick B5708, and this is actually a reproduction vintage pattern from 1953. So that's when it was originally designed, which is why it's got that really nice shaped bodice and then a flared skirt, which you can wear a petticoat underneath. And this particular style I think is really nice because there's lots of different ways that you can tie the ties at the top. So you can have it on both shoulders, you can have it as one shoulder, and you can have it as strapless. So lots of versatility there. For this pattern, we only actually have 3 different pattern pieces. So for the front and back bodice, we have one big bit like this with the neck ties. And as you can see, that comes to a point in the middle there. So that's sort of an upper bodice part. And then we have these sort of lower bodice parts. There's 2 of them that join together, and these are the bits that are going to sit around your waist and they'll attach to the upper bodice parts here. Now in cutting mine out, I've decided to go for a vertical stripe on the bits that go around my waist because I think that might be more slimming, and then a horizontal stripe on the upper bodice parts to get some nice contrast there. We also then have 4 skirt pieces which use the same pattern piece for the front and the back, and so the skirt consists of 4 panels. Now I've already gone through and cut out my pattern pieces in the fabric, as you can see, and I've also transferred my notches and my tailor's tacks, you can see on the bodice there. If you've got any questions about how to do those parts of the pattern, you can look back to my shift dress tutorial on this channel where I talk through all of those. So now I've got everything cut out, it's time to start sewing it all together. I'm going to start with the bodice front, and the first step on the upper bodice piece is to ease stitch, which I've never really used before, but it says to do long stitching between these 2 dots, and then I think you can sort of leave long end tails at either end, and then you can use that to gather up the fabric a little bit for when we attach the side panels. So I'm going to change the setting on my machine to have a long stitch, and then I'm just going to do a line of that in between both of these dots. I've done those lines of ease stitching now, and you can see that they're already starting to sort of gather up that edge there. I normally use a 2.5 stitch length for my normal stitching, so for that ease stitch I use a 4, and then as you can see I've left these sort of long tails so that I can adjust the gathering as needed. So then the next step is to sew the 2 front midriff pieces together at this short seam before we attach it to the upper bodice piece. We've got our 2 center front pieces sewn together like that now, and I'm going to press those seams nice and flat, and then I'm going to attach it to this piece along this sort of triangle edge. I think the reason we've got the ease stitches is because we'll have to sort of ease that in a little bit to make sure it fits properly. So just to give you a bit of extra guidance on how I've dealt with pinning this, because it is quite tricky. So I've sort of started at the middle, and I've used the notches that are there to try and match. So I've matched those. I've sort of started from one side, pinned up there, adjusting my gathering stitches as needed. Then I've kind of left this triangular point in the middle for now, and then I've gone along the other side, again adjusting those stitches as needed. So here we are at my machine. So I'm going to start at one end, back stitch as always, work my way down one side, then I'm going to slow down slightly as I get to this point, and it's important to make sure that when we're just getting the right bits of fabric in, so we don't want to sew through too many layers of fabric. Okay, I'm going to sew down to that circle. I'm going to put my needle in, lift it, again pivot around, then I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to work my way up the other side. So I've sewn that in place for my front piece now. It is quite difficult to get that point. I haven't quite got it perfectly, but I'm hopeful that pressing it out will help. So just take it slowly around the point, and if you need to unpick and readjust, you can always do that. That's why we have unpickers. So I had to do that a few times, but I've now got that stitched in, and I'm liking the contrast there. So I think that's gonna look nice as a bodice piece. So then the next step we have is to do the same thing with the back. For the side seam for the bodice, because we have a side zip on this project rather than a back zip, we're just going to pin together the right side seam, and that's the only one that we're going to sew at this stage. And you sew up to the large circle, which we've noted with a tailor's tack. So the first step for the skirt is to sew in our gathering stitches. So basically at the moment we've got these 4 big skirt panels. We're going to sew in our gathering stitches, and basically that's going to allow us to create a nice full skirt by gathering the fabric up like that. So for the gathering stitches, I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching at the top of each of my skirt panel pieces, and I'm going to make sure that I start and end the lines of stitching within the seam allowance. So that means that when the panels are joined together, I can still access the long threads at the end of it to pull the stitches in. And on my machine, I'm going to have a setting 4 for stitch length, so we're going to use a long stitch length. So just to show you on my machine, I'm going to pull out the threads here, so I've got a nice long tail. I've already sewn 1 line of stitching, and I just like to space it using my presser foot. So I've done the 1 line of stitching, and I'm just going to do another one very close to it. And then once I reach the end, I don't do any back stitching. I pull the thread ends nice and long, and then I trim them there. And we've now got the 2 lines of gather stitching there ready to go. So I'm going to do that for all of my panels. I've got all of my gathering stitches sewn in across all my panel pieces. My next step is then to attach my 2 front panels and my 2 back panels. Now we've got our 2 front pieces sewn together and our 2 back pieces sewn together, we're going to start to bring the skirt together a little bit more. So the first step of that is going to be to pin together the front and back at one seam. So I've got my 2 front pieces here, my 2 back pieces here, and I'm going to sew all the way down this side seam. It'll be, yeah, this is the side seam. So I'm going to do that with a normal seam allowance, and then the other side we're also going to stitch that together. But when we do that seam, we're only going to stitch up to this tailor's tack or the large circle on the pattern, because this bit needs to stay open, because that's where the zip's going to come in. So I've now stitched all of my skirt panels together, but here ending at where the big circle is for the zip. So I've now got this very long skirt that's ready to be all gathered up into a nice full skirt. And the next step is going to be to pin the skirt piece to the bodice piece that we sewed earlier. So as part of this, you're going to want to use your gathering stitches to start to gather your skirt pieces up so that they're the right length to fit with your bodice piece, and you're going to want to match your side seams with your bodice side seams. So again, this is one of those processes in sewing that just takes time, so you just need to sort of mold your gathering, bring it in, bring it out, make sure that you like the way it's sitting, make sure your gathers are nice and even. I've gone and pinned my bodice and my skirt piece together. So we've got all these gathers which look very nice, lovely full skirt. So I pinned those together, and as I was going around, I sort of made the sections fit, and then I went in and started to try and sort of even out the gathers. I am going to sew the bodice and the skirt together, and it says to use a double stitch, so stitch 2 lines. So you stitch along the seam line, So that will be the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you stitch again 1/4 of an inch in. So basically that's just sort of reinforcing that seam, which is good because it's holding this gathered fabric, which could be quite heavy for this bodice. Now we've got our bodice piece attached to our skirt piece. We're now going to put in the invisible zip that goes on our side seam. So I don't think I mentioned at the beginning of this project, but you do need a 14-inch invisible zip for this project. Bombay Stores Fabric have really kindly sent me this one in a gorgeous matching lilac colour. I've also just reinforced the side seams of my bodice just because, with a bit of interfacing, just because this fabric is very lightweight and delicate, and I just want to make sure that I've got the stability there for the zip. So when I'm working with invisible zips, I like to sort of lay it face up towards me. I like to open the zip almost to the end, and then I flip the zip tape like this so that I can then line up the zip tape with the raw edge of the fabric, and then the teeth are in here. And on this project, the zip will end where this large circle was on your pattern piece, so sort of where the upper bodice piece joined this midriff piece. I'm just going to keep the zip open while I stitch that in, and I'm going to use my invisible zip foot on my machine to stitch in this side. Again, you can check out my other video tutorial on this channel on the shift dress that I made, and I talk through that in detail about the different presser feet that you can use with it. So I've now sewn in one side of my invisible zip, so that went in quite nice and easily. So to prepare for doing the other side, I'm going to close the zip on this side, and it goes nice and smoothly. And then where my waistband is here, I'm just going to do a tiny snip with my massive scissors. We better use small scissors anyway. You can also mark it with tailor's chalk. I quite like to do a tiny snip. And basically that's going to help me line up my zip, because when I do it on the other side, I know that I need to line up the top and line up where the waistband is. So I've now put my zip in, my nice invisible zip here, and because it's a nice matching colour, it is quite invisible, which is good. I've tried the dress on and it feels like it's a little bit baggy for me in the back and the front. I know it's kind of supposed to have a bit of a boat neck, but I'm not sure about it. I don't know if other people making this pattern have had this issue, but yeah, and it might be a case of practicing tying it and things, but I think I'm going to put the lining in and then I'm going to see if I need to make any adjustments to just make the fit better. With the lining, the option with this pattern is to self-line it, which means that you use the lining fabric is the same as the outer fabric of the dress. I guess that works well with the ties as well, unless you wanted a contrast, which you could do. So basically for the lining, you just prepare the bodice pieces. So you've got the front piece and the back piece in the same way as you do for the main bodice. And then you just, so I've done that. So I've got my midriff pieces attached to my upper bodice pieces for the back and the front. And then you just have to attach them at the side like you did with the main bodice piece, just on one side. So we still keep that other side open. And then the other thing that you do before you attach it to your bodice is we're going to press down the seam allowance on the lower edge of the lining. You're then going to put right sides together and we're going to pin all the way around the lining, basically. Not down the zip side, but we're going to pin all the way around the neckties, all the way around the neckline, all the way around the armholes. Sewn all around and attach my lining, and I've just done a quick check as well to make sure that it's all connected properly. So the next step in the pattern is to trim down all of the raw edges around the lining, so I'm going to do that with my pinking shears. And then there's also the option to understitch the neck edge. I don't think I'm going to do that yet because I want to see what the fit is like. But basically understitching is where you trim it and then you press down the seam allowances both facing in the same direction, and then you do a really close to the seam line stitch to sort of flatten everything out. So once you've understitched, if you choose to understitch, the next step is some hand sewing. So I've already done mine, but basically this is to attach the lining on the inside to the dress. So we flip it down over the zip and we hand stitch it to the zip tape, and then we go along around where the skirt joins the bodice, all around the waistline, and we hand stitch along there as well. And I always flip up my raw seam allowances from sewing my bodice to my skirt so that they get captured within the lining. And I've got some loose threads to trim, but you can see that it looks quite nice and neat in there now, and then that's more comfortable to wear. So I've just done that using a normal slip stitch. So then the last step is just to hem, and obviously up to you how you decide to hem it. I've pressed up and then pressed up again so that I'm got my raw edge hidden, and I haven't hemmed it by that much because I quite like to keep this style of dress quite long as it was worn in the 50s. I've also done some more experimenting with the fit and found that for me, if I wear this backwards, it actually fits a lot better, because this front part where it's just got a really wide neck, it just doesn't work on my body shape, it all gapes and everything. But because of the back has got shorter neckties and a higher neckline, it just works better for me. But overall, I'm really happy with how this make has turned out. I think this fabric looks lovely. I think it suits the pattern really well. So I definitely recommend checking it out. It was really nice to work with. Feels lovely on the skin as well. So thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing all of your creations. Bye!